Welcome to The Breakdown with INFB. We're your host, Garrett Kelly.
And Heidi Gant.
Although Indiana Farm Bureau is a statewide ag organization, a lot of what our farmers do is impacted at the federal and global level through issues like trade and labor.
So today we're talking with Congressman Rudy Yakym, representing the 2nd District in Northern Indiana, to help us better understand some of the agricultural issues from the federal level. So thank you and welcome, Congressman.
You bet. Thanks for having me on today.
Yes, thanks for joining us, Congressman. Before we get into some of the federal agricultural issues, can you tell us a little bit about your background before you got into public service? And then was public service something that was always on your mind? Did you always think at some point you'd run for office?
Well, I'm a 4th-generation Hoosier, grew up here in the Hoosier State and still live here, married for 18 years, and we have 3 children. My wife is a 3rd-grade school teacher in Elkhart County where our children go to school. And I just commute back and forth to Washington to go to work. But on background, I'm a business person and really grew up in the business community, the business world, helping people grow companies, starting companies myself as well, and really just focused on matters of business. And so I approach my role as a United States representative as someone with a business background, understanding what the concerns are, what the issues are, how federal government overreach really has so oftentimes a negative impact as we're trying to conduct business. I think the same is true for our Hoosier farmers as well. And so that's a little bit about my background and how I approach the role as a United States representative.
That's great. So now you represent Indiana's 2nd Congressional District, a role previously held by the late Jackie Walorski. I know Indiana Farm Bureau always loved our relationship with Jackie and always considered her a strong advocate for agricultural issues and a good friend. How did she impact you in what you do now in Washington?
Well, Jackie was a dear friend of mine. I actually worked for her back on her 2012 campaign as her finance director. And she and I remained close friends until the day that she passed away. She was such a fighter and an advocate for Hoosier interest. She really taught me what it means to advocate on behalf of your district, to really listen to the people inside the district and then take their concerns to Washington. So, I mean, just such a tragic set of circumstances, but she's someone who I'm certainly glad to have the opportunity to continue to blaze the trail that she created in this district. And I do know that one of the things she taught me was that the Indiana farm policy as it relates to what she took to Washington was oftentimes more than not a reflection of the Indiana Farm Bureau policy. And so she spent a lot of time talking to me about the relationship she had with Farm Bureau. And that is certainly one of the many aspects of her legacy that I seek to continue in my role as the 2nd Congressional District representative.
Great. So you had some background, you knew, some of the players, but now you've been in Congress, almost 2 years now. What's kind of been the biggest surprise or the thing that kind of had you scratching your head a little bit or that you've had to work your way through?
Yeah, I would give you a couple different surprises in Washington. One is that the United States Congress, as our founding fathers intended, is fundamentally a good reflection on the American people, meaning you find people who are very far to the left, very far to the right, and right smack in the middle ideologically in Congress. You find people from all walks of life, all backgrounds, whether it's people in business, people in medicine. There's a lot of farmers that are in Congress, people from the non-for-profit world, all backgrounds, all religions. You find people who are, really, really smart, and maybe some people who aren't in U.S. Congress, but that's also what you find in the United States of America. And so the system in that regard is working as intended. I would also add that the other surprise is that the people who are really truly effective in Congress are very different from who the American people believe is effective. And what I mean by that is you often think that the people who are effective are the ones who you see yelling on TV all the time. And that's not really the case. And I define effectiveness as I can walk into a committee chair's office, like G.T. Thompson, chair of the Agricultural Committee. And I can talk about the priorities of my district and have a reasonable expectation that some of those priorities might be incorporated into big key pieces of legislation, as opposed to them just saying, well, get out of my office. So I think that the people who are truly effective in Washington, based on my observation, are the ones who are willing to show up, be very well prepared. They know and understand the issues, and they keep their head down and they go to work, as opposed to just yelling on TV and throwing bombs back and forth nonstop.
Yeah, I love hearing that. And you mentioned GT Thompson, so that's a good segue in talking about the Farm Bill, which is I know has been a huge part of what we do at Indiana Farm Bureau, and especially the past few years in working on the 2018 Farm Bill and reauthorizing that. So I know the process in getting a new Farm Bill passed has been a challenge the past couple of years. What's been your experience in watching that play out, especially recently? And are there big priorities that you would like to see in the Farm Bill, this being your first one that you've been a part of?
Sure. From my end of the spectrum, we started with doing a lot of listening tours around our farms in the Hoosier District last year. We made over 30 farming stops, and that's everything from people who are growing crops to ranchers and just many farming interests across the district, and really listening to what their priorities are. Being a businessman as opposed to a farmer, I certainly appreciate what our farmers do because we see it on our kitchen table at home every single day. But without having that direct farming experience, I thought it was really important in the early days of my tenure in Congress to spend a lot of time with our farmers. Those, particularly the farmers affiliated with Farm Bureau, who would really be a great voice for the priorities that should be in the Farm Bill. We took the Indiana Farm Bureau priorities and we, along with our farmers on the ground here in the second district, we bundled them up, and I would talk regularly with GT Thompson, and my team would speak regularly with the Agricultural Committee staff about what those priorities would be. And so I feel very confident that when the Farm Bill is ultimately totally done, passed, signed by the President of the United States, that the priorities of Hoosier farmers in that final bill will be incorporated, as we've got a great relationship with the Agricultural Committee chair, and those relationships in Washington matter as it relates to getting policy advanced and ultimately in a final bill text.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I know our public policy staff, I've attended some of those farm visits that you've done with our members, and I know our staff is very grateful for the work that they do with you and have always sung your praises. So we appreciate that.
You bet.
Congressman, when you talk to other congressmen and women and from different states and the committee chair, do you think there's a consensus among American ag on kind of what is the most important aspects of this farm bill?
There seems to be a consensus amongst the farmers in my district and the farmers in the Hoosier state. And speaking with that one voice through places like Indiana Farm Bureau is certainly very helpful. I would say that there is a very different track when you go to the United States Congress. You have Republicans and Democrats divided on what the priorities should be, but also it's not necessarily totally uniform across the Republican Party either. There are significant divisions even within our own party, within my own party, on what the priorities should be inside the Farm Bill. And that is the single biggest reason why I value the relationships that I have with the farmers in our district and with the Indiana Farm Bureau, because it helps orient me on what those priorities should be and what we should be advocating for in Washington. But without those relationships in the farming community here, it'd be very difficult for me to navigate what we should be advocating for in Washington.
Perfect.
Yeah. So let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk trade. So I know that that's always a big talking point, especially in agriculture. Indiana is one of the largest agricultural exporters in the U.S. So how do you think we can maintain those great trade relationships that we already have and even maybe make them better in the future?
Well, there's a number of ways that happens. First of all, it's based on we want to make sure that the world knows that from the Hoosier State we can feed the world from here. Of course, a lot of our agricultural products stay here in the Hoosier State. They stay here domestically around the country, but we also ship a lot internationally. I've talked with many of our farmers who ship things overseas, and we want to make sure that the world markets remain open for business as it relates to our Hoosier agricultural products. I'll give you an example where they weren't open that we've been a leader on. We're all aware of what Mexico did in banning the GMO corn in Mexico, and that was in direct violation of the USMCA. And so for me, out of my office, we actually led a letter to the United States Trade Representative asking them to open a formal dispute against Mexico on this particular topic. And following our letter, they did open that formal dispute. That's working through the process right now. But I do believe that it's important that we make sure that global markets are open for business as it relates to Hoosier agricultural products.
Great. Let's keep them rolling. So another topic that Indiana farmers care a lot about is labor, which a lot of times means issuing through the H-2A program, and also the necessity of that program. You've been outspoken on what's going on at the border and with immigration during this administration. How do you think we can effectively utilize the H-2A program to meet the needs of our farmers while also managing what's happening at the border?
It's a sad matter of fact that there aren't enough Americans to do the work on our Hoosier farms. And the H-2A program is certainly a key component to making sure that we have the workers. And I support making reforms to the H-2A program, whether it's doing things like making it a year-round program or other enhancements that we can make to the H-2A program. It's a critical component that our Hoosier farmers certainly rely on. But unfortunately, in order to continue to make progress on some of these things that are meaningful to Hoosier farmers, we also have to make progress on the top issue that we hear about from the district, which is securing the southern border. Unfortunately, under President Biden, every community has become a border community. We continue to see record numbers of crossings down at the southern border, illegal crossings. Every community is experiencing a fentanyl crisis. Many communities are overrun with illegal immigrants coming in from the southern border. And unfortunately, a lot of those illegal immigrants, they can't just come here and show up and go to work, which is what our Hoosier farmers need them to do. So this is why I support making additional H-2A reforms. But we have to secure the southern border. We've chronicled in our office 64 executive orders that President Biden signed on day one that created the crisis at the southern border. He created that crisis with the stroke of a pen. He can fix it with the stroke of a pen, and we have called on him to do just that.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic that I'm sure will just continue to play out over the next few years. So when talking with farmers in some of your tool sheds or, farm visits that you do, what's the biggest non-ag issue that you've heard from some farmers?
Sure. Well, we just spoke a moment ago about the southern border. That's a huge issue. We hear regularly about regulatory overreach and regulatory burden from the Biden administration. It could be something like WOTUS, which is a huge issue for farmers, but also a big issue for non-farmers that we hear about nonstop. We hear about inflation. We hear about executive actions taken by the Biden administration, including the student loan. People call student loan forgiveness. It's really a student loan transfer from people who went to college and borrowed money to people who didn't go to college and still paid taxes. But we also hear about the Consumer Protection Financial Bureau and the overreach that happens through that agency. We hear about things like central bank digital currency, and we hear about spying on Americans. We hear all of those things, and we've got legislative fixes for each of those in the United States Congress that we've been working on and playing a role in. And so those are some of the big issues. But then the other really big issue is the issue of inflation. We hear about that from our Hoosier farmers in terms of the cost of inputs, whether it's the cost of their seed, the cost of the fertilizer, the cost of labor, the cost of diesel fuel. And we are very well aware of the specific actions that the Biden administration has taken that has driven up those costs. But the issue of inflation, we also hear about from just everyday Hoosiers around Indiana's 2nd District. They know this and they feel this when they go to the grocery store and they look at all the costs at the grocery store. And really, when you go upstream from there, of course, you get to our Hoosier farmers, but then you have to go further upstream from there and look at the cost of their inputs to production, which have only skyrocketed and compressed their margins as well. So those are some of the really big issues that we hear about from around the Hoosier state.
I guess I would kind of flip on Heidi's original question. So when you meet with non-ag groups, is there something in particular, maybe even about agriculture that they're discussing?
Non-ag groups, whether it's your everyday consumer or even your businesses, their real big issue outside of the border is inflation. And again, this comes right back to the prices that people are paying at the grocery store. And this is really impacting our seniors who have seen their cost to maintain their standard of living go up much faster than their incomes have gone up. Social Security, if you're dependent upon retirement savings, dependent upon a fixed income, you might only be getting a few points per year, but food inflation has gone up substantially more than that. You're pretty deeper, much deeper into the double digits on food price inflation. And so those are some of the big issues that we hear about from every citizen. I'll be literally at the grocery store and people will stop me at the grocery store and say, wow, can you believe how much it costs for this item? And a lot of that goes back to, again, many actions that the Biden administration has taken to do things that cause us to restrict supply, which of course, as we all know, drives up the overall cost.
So I guess that kind of ties into my follow-up question there is what's the solution then, do you think is just taking back some of those things that this current administration has done, or what do you think is the solution there to help?
Well, let's start with the regulatory burden. We passed the REINS Act out of the House of Representatives, which would require that new regulations from the Biden administration or from any future administration, which would have an economic impact of 100 million or more, those regulations end up being subject to congressional review and input. Right now, every time you have a new regulation that causes supply to restrict or causes business prices to go up or inputs of production to go up, you end up by default creating inflation. Another solution is we've got to restore fiscal responsibility to Washington. We are racking up, we've already racked up around $35 trillion of national debt, and we're adding $2.5 trillion per year of additional national debt to our kids and grandkids on a tab that they'll have to pay someday. And so what we have to focus on, this is why I'm on the House Budget Committee, in addition to transportation and infrastructure, is we've got to get a hold of our national spending. We've got to restore fiscal responsibility to Washington, because as long as the federal government is spending $2.5 trillion more than we're taking in, we're going to end up in a position where inflation will continue to be out of control.
Great. So we've had kind of a big picture look at some of those big topics. On a more personal level, what bills are you leading and focused on getting passed?
Well, I'll give you a couple different bills that I'm really focused on. One is the Protect Jewish Students and Faculty Act. We've seen just a wave of anti-Semitism that has taken place across our country on college campuses. And these colleges and universities, they should be fighting anti-Semitism, not fueling it. And I've got a bill to make sure that they do just that by actually having the definition of anti-Semitism on their books as a policy to enforce as a condition for receiving Title IV federal funding. I also have an Improper Payments Transparency Act. That bill will focus on the reality that 1/3 of the payments in some of our federal programs, 1 out of 3 payments that the federal government makes is improper. More often than not, it's an overpayment, not an underpayment. Some of that is they just accidentally pay out too much. Some of that is there's fraudulent activity that takes place in some of these programs. We want to make sure that we get a hold of that. And so I've got a bill that will help us focus on reducing improper payments out of our federal government.
Okay. And to kind of start wrapping this up, a big question that I think a lot of people want to know from our members in Congress is this Congress has seen its share of polarizing moments and party struggles. I think you kind of alluded to that earlier. So how have you navigated that and been able to stay focused on what your priorities are?
I think a lot of it deals with, are you someone who goes to Washington and you have a team that is built on creating your next soundbite on national TV? Or are they focused on actually putting their heads down and doing the work that leads to results for the American people? And for us, we focus on, between the House Budget Committee, but also on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, a lot of the work that we do is nonpartisan. I've got a number of things I'm working on that aren't necessarily the partisan stuff that you see making the news all the time. It might be something like the Sergeant Ted Grubbs Mental Health Care for Disabled Veterans Act, which is named after a disabled veteran in my district that had a mental health crisis and he needed help, but he couldn't get it. But it might be something like working on infrastructure projects around the country or additional permitting reforms. We work very well with not only Republicans, but also Democrats. I mentioned the Improper Payments Transparency Act. That's a bill that I'm co-leading with a guy named Jimmy Panetta, Democrat from California. I mentioned the Protect Jewish Students and Faculty Act. That is a bill that I'm co-leading with Hillary Skolton, a Democrat from Michigan. So these are ideas maybe that came out of our office or originated from us making those requests. But we work on these with Democrat co-sponsors when there are issues that we can agree bipartisanly on. Some of the farm bill stuff that we work on, a lot of that's with Republicans, but some of it's with Democrats too. So we just really go to work and we find people that we can agree with in Washington that share our values and share some of the same goals as we do. And we just put our head down and we go to work. So while people are making noise on national TV and yelling at each other in the hallways, if you see me on camera during one of those, it's because I'm walking by quickly in the background, going to work for Hoosiers, as opposed to stopping and yelling at a TV camera.
That's amazing. Well, we'll let you put your head down and go to work. Representative Yakym, we know you got a busy schedule. We really want to thank you for joining us today, for meeting with our members in your district often, and that you'll continue to do that in the future. We really appreciate that.
Well, thanks for having me on, and thanks for all the work that our Hoosier farmers do to feed the district, the state, and ultimately the world. And thank you for all the input that you've had in my office as it relates to the Farm Bill, for your priorities and making sure we know how to push back against federal government overreach.
Awesome. Thank you, Congressman.
Take care.
If you enjoyed our conversation today, make sure to subscribe to The Breakdown with INFB and even rate and review us to let us know how we're doing. For more information, visit www.infb.org/podcast.